She splashed mud on a quiet old man and kept driving like nothing happened. The next morning, 4 Navy SEALs stood at her gate, and they weren't there for apologies. Curtis Bramley didn't ask for attention. That's the first thing folks in Brambleton tend to forget. The man had a way of blending in, not because he lacked presence, but because he wasn't looking for praise. He'd been through too much for that. That morning, Curtis stepped off the Route 28 bus like he had 100 times before, same wool coat draped over his shoulders, same slow but steady gait. He carried a manila folder under one arm. Test results from the VA sealed tight. His other hand rested on the cane he'd used ever since his left hip stopped cooperating. It had rained earlier, one of those spring rains that makes everything stick to your shoes. Grit, leaves, old gum someone spat out last fall. Curtis moved with care, keeping close to the curb. He glanced once to his right, saw no cars, and began to cross the street. That's when the white Escalade came flying around the corner. IT didn't slow down, didn't swerve, just clipped the edge of a wide puddle and sent a wall of cold, dirty water straight into Curtis's legs. It soaked his pants up to the thighs. Mud clung to his coat like paint. His manila folder slipped, smacked the pavement, and split open. The SUV kept going. Behind the wheel was Celeste Duveau. Everyone in Brambleton knew her name, or at least knew her money. Art dealer turned heiress. 3 properties across the county hosted wine tastings for causes she never stayed long enough to understand. Always dressed like she had somewhere better to be, she didn't stop. Curtis stood still for a moment, looked down. Wet, cold, his papers ruined. Then he leaned over, slowly, picked them up one by one. Not even a sigh escaped his lips. Just the quiet crinkle of wet paper in shaking hands. A younger man across the street, a kid named Troy, who worked weekends at the gas station, watched it happen. He was the only one who said something later. I don't think she even saw him, Troy muttered to his coworker that afternoon. Or maybe she just didn't care. Back across the street, Curtis kept walking. No yelling, no middle finger, no complaint. He passed the florist, the bakery, and then the corner where a pawn shop stood half abandoned. His bus pass still hung around his neck, limp and damp. The mud had started to dry into crusty blotches. One woman did see him, though. Mrs. Anita Ridgway, retired schoolteacher, lived 2 doors down from Curtis' apartment. She stood frozen outside the bakery, one hand on a brown paper bag, eyes tracking every slow step he took. When he finally reached his building, Curtis paused, not out of exhaustion, he was used to that, but because his key got stuck. Again, after a few wiggles and a deep breath, he got it to turn. Inside, the heater ticked. A small dog barked 2 floors up, and Curtis peeled his coat off like it weighed more than it should. He hung it by the door, kicked off his shoes, and sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't curse, didn't mumble. He just looked out the window, past the clothesline, past the trash bins, toward the street where part of him still stood, back at that curb, covered in mud. Curtis had spent 19 years in the army. Places like Kandahar and Al-Udeid weren't just names to him. They were months. Years. He wasn't a man who needed to be thanked every time someone saw a flag. But this? This wasn't oversight. This was how some people learned to see others. As invisible. But the next morning, the gate buzzer at Celeste Duvois' estate rang before breakfast. And it wasn't the gardener. By the time the sun had crept fully over the rooftops the next morning, Brambleton had already begun its quiet murmur. This wasn't a town where things stayed secret for long. Not because folks gossiped with malice, but because they didn't have much else to talk about. At Deason's Hardware, 2 older men, Benji Thorne and Cliff Garland, leaned over the counter nursing black coffee from chipped mugs. The weather was always the lead-in, but that morning it didn't last long. "You see Bramley yesterday?" Benji asked. After that Escalade hit the puddle? Cliff replied, "Yeah, I seen him. Poor fella looked like he crawled through a ditch." Neither of them laughed. Neither of them thought it was funny. He didn't even raise his voice. Benji said, shaking his head. Didn't even wipe off the papers. Just pick them up like it was normal. Cliff took a sip. Might be normal to him. Just down the road at Finch's Cafe, the conversation took a different shape. A woman named Tressa Nolan leaned across the booth toward her sister-in-law. Lowering her voice, I heard it was Celeste Duveau that splashed him. Seriously? Her sister-in-law blinked. Well, I wouldn't be surprised, you know how she is. Thinks anyone without a driver is part of the furniture. I mean, what's he supposed to do? Tressa continued, sue her. She probably wouldn't even remember doing it. Curtis Bramley, meanwhile, wasn't part of the conversation. He never was. He lived 3 blocks away from the buzz, spent most days between the VA clinic and his small apartment, and never asked for favors. But this time, the silence hit different. It wasn't just the splash. It was the way no one expected anything to come of it. People cared, sure, but not enough to actually act except 4 men. They weren't from Brambleton. Not originally, they came in unannounced. No reporters. No cameras, just boots, tired eyes, and quiet purpose. Reese Godwin was the one who rang the buzzer. Former SEAL, now working in logistics out of Charleston, broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, and the kind of calm that unsettled people without trying. Next to him stood Alonzo Cruz, retired in Tallahassee, walked with a slight limp from a parachute accident. His hands always in his pockets, like he was holding on to something he didn't want to share. Tanner Bledsoe leaned against the gates column. Lived in Jackson, Mississippi now. Wore sunglasses that made people second-guess themselves, and Jory Flint, youngest of the 4. The only one still technically active, on extended leave. Just watched the intercom like it was ticking down to something. Celeste Duvau's voice crackled through the speaker. Yes, Reese kept it simple. We need to speak with you. About Curtis Bramley. A pause, then static. Then silence. She didn't respond. Inside her estate, Celeste stood in a silk robe with a grapefruit untouched on the table. Her phone buzzed with gallery emails and committee updates. But for once, none of it pulled her attention. She didn't recognize the names, didn't know who these men were, didn't like being approached. And yet, there was something in the tone. Not anger, not entitlement, just something too steady to ignore. She didn't open the gate that morning. But later that day, she asked her assistant, Liana, to do a little digging. Curtis Bramley, she said casually, as though she were recalling a minor donor, can you find out if he's on any community boards? Or anything else? Liana paused. Did he apply for something through the foundation? No, Celeste replied. He. Crossed my mind. The town kept talking. At the corner store, a boy named Wesley posted about the splash on his Instagram story. By sunset, it had a 100 views.no caption, just a slow zoom on muddy footprints leading into an apartment building. Meanwhile, Curtis sat on his porch with a crossword puzzle. He'd been watching the neighbors cat chase birds again, and no one came by. No one said much. He didn't know about the gate dot or the 4 men, or that his name had begun circulating like wind through a wheat field. Low, constant, and hard to hold. But the 4 men hadn't come for drama. They came with a purpose, and Celeste was about to learn what it was. Celeste Duvau's estate was the kind of place that made you feel like you needed an appointment just to glance at the gate. The black wrought iron fence wrapped around 3 manicured acres, where boxwood hedges were trimmed with surgical precision and water trickled from a marble fountain that no one but the gardener cared about. By the next morning, the buzz at the front gate wasn't coming from a delivery truck or a catering service. It was Reese again. He pressed the intercom. Just once. No impatience. No repetition. He just stood there while the morning fog clung to the top of the hedges. Inside, Celeste had dressed already slacks, silk blouse, flats. Nothing flashy. But she hadn't slept well. Something about that name, Curtis Bramley, had stuck. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the steadiness of the voice yesterday. Maybe it was the fact that her assistant had emailed her late last night with one line, "He's not just some guy." She looked at the security screen and saw them again. All 4, standing the same way they had yesterday, silent. Still. Waiting against her instincts, Celeste pressed the button. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice clipped but curious. Reese leaned forward slightly. "Because you owe a man something you didn't know you took." Celeste paused. "I don't owe anyone anything. I didn't even see him." "That's the problem," Alonzo said, stepping forward. "You didn't see him. I don't know what this is," she replied, trying to stay firm. "But if you're here to cause a scene." "We are not," Reese cut in. "We won't raise our voices. We are not breaking anything. But we are staying here until you hear us out." Celeste hesitated. She wasn't used to being told anything. Not by strangers, not in her own driveway. But something in the way they stood. It wasn't confrontation. It was conviction. That was different. That unnerved her more than if they'd been yelling. She sighed and buzzed the gate open. The 4 men walked in with quiet steps. Not a word between them until they reached the front porch. Celeste stayed behind the glass door, cracked it just enough to speak through. "You want coffee?" she asked, unexpectedly. Tanner blinked. Didn't think that'd be your next move. I don't like people standing around my front door. Better to keep things civil, she muttered. Civil is good, Jory said softly. They came in. The living room was pristine cream furniture. Abstract art. Not a speck of dust. The kind of place that looks like no one's ever actually sat in it. Reese noticed how Celeste didn't offer them a seat. Just kept walking toward the kitchen and talking like it was an interview she hadn't agreed to. So. Speak. I assume this is about yesterday. It's about Curtis, Reese said, folding his arms about what he represents. And what you didn't see when you splashed him. Look, I didn't do it on purpose that I don't go around flinging mud on people. It was an accident. We are not saying you aimed for the puddle. Alonzo replied. We are saying you didn't look. You didn't check who you hit. You didn't stop, Celeste tilted her head, and you think standing in my living room, reminding me of that, is going to change what? Jory spoke now, for the first time. It's not about changing what happened. It's about showing you what you missed. Tanner stepped forward and pulled something from his coat pocket. A photograph. It was worn, edges curled. He handed it to her. In the picture, 5 men stood together in front of a military transport vehicle. Sand in the background, guns slung. Fatigue uniforms. Dust on their faces. One of them was Curtis Bramley. Younger, but clearly him. Standing tall. That's your neighbor, Reese said. That man held a position on a rooftop in southern Afghanistan for 9 hours, so an entire squad could evacuate safely. Didn't ask questions, didn't expect a thank you, took shrapnel through his side, and still wouldn't leave his post until every last man was off the ground. Celeste looked down at the photo again. I didn't know, she said, her voice lower now. You didn't ask, Alonzo replied. That's the point. The air shifted in the room. A long silence fell between them. Celeste looked at the men, each one different but somehow the same. They weren't angry. They weren't trying to shame her, they just wanted her to see. Are you asking for something? She finally said. No, Reese answered. We are offering something. She looked confused. A chance to understand, he added. But understanding meant seeing Curtis up close, and that wasn't something Celeste had ever truly done. Celeste Duvaux didn't like loose ends. She built her reputation, and her fortune, on knowing the full story before anyone else did. So that afternoon, after the 4 men left her home without so much as asking for water, she did what she always did when something didn't sit right. She made calls. Her first was to Lydia Thorne, a city councilwoman and a longtime friend of the arts. Lydia answered on the second ring. Celeste, you never called during the week. What's going on? Do you know anything about a man named Curtis Bramley? Celeste asked, wasting no time. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then, sure, quiet guy. Lives near the post office. He came to one of our town meetings a few months back about the VA bus stop getting moved. Why? Do you know anything about his background? Celeste's voice lowered. Military? Oh, definitely, Lydia replied. Army vet. I think he's got some sort of commendation. Silver Star or maybe bronze. Why? Celeste didn't answer, she just thanked her and hung up. Next she called Preston Foy, the director of the Brambleton Veteran Support Centre. The two had attended a fundraiser together a year ago. Celeste had barely spoken to him then, but now she needed information. Fast. Preston wasn't as warm. Celeste, this is unexpected, he said, his tone flat. I need to ask you about someone. Who? Curtis Bramley. That name changed something. There was a beat. A shift. I won't give out personal details, Preston replied. But yes, I know him. We all do. He's one of the few who comes to the grief support groups and never talks about himself. I need to understand, Celeste admitted, her voice sounding unfamiliar to even herself. Understand what? He asked. What kind of man he is. Preston hesitated. He's the kind of man who'd rather carry your groceries in silence than accept a thank you he didn't earn. That answer stuck. Celeste didn't ask more. She closed her laptop, stood at her window, and stared out at her own reflection. Curtis Bramley. She'd lived in the same town as him for over a decade, shopped at the same stores, driven past him more times than she could count. And not once had she ever seen him. Not really. Back across town, Curtis was fixing a loose hinge on his screen door. The metal squeaked every time the wind blew. He didn't like noise, didn't like interruptions. So he was taking care of it the only way he knew how. Quietly. Methodically, alone, inside, his phone buzzed once. A message from Reese. She opened the door. Curtis didn't reply. He just stood there on his porch, squinting into the afternoon light, wondering what kind of door had really opened and whether it mattered. That evening, Celeste sat down at her dining table and pulled out the photo Tanner had left behind. She studied Curtis' face younger, sunburnt, but with the same eyes, tired, focused, present. She flipped the photo over. In the corner, faint pencil marks. Kandahar .04. FOB dust off. Something about those words rattled her. They felt heavier than any sculpture or oil painting she'd ever curated. She opened her laptop and started searching. For the first time in a long time, Celeste DeVoe went down a path she hadn't paved herself. She read about forward operating base dust-off, found records, incident reports, and one article from 2005. Local military newsletter, long archived. Staff Sergeant Curtis J. Bramley remained at his post under heavy fire to provide cover during the extraction of 11 personnel. Despite sustaining injuries, Bramley refused evacuation until every team member was secured. His actions prevented further casualties. Celeste read it twice, then a third time. Then she closed her laptop slowly and leaned back in her chair, hands resting in her lap. She felt something she hadn't expected. Not guilt, not even shame. She felt ignorant. She felt small, and above all, she felt curious. About a man she'd mistaken for invisible. But if Celeste really wanted to understand Curtis, she'd have to stop looking through reports and start seeing the man behind them. Curtis Bramley never spoke much about the desert. Not to his neighbors. Not even to his brothers from the unit after they came home. The war didn't live in stories for him. It lived in details. In smells.in sounds. And in silence. It was August 12, 2004. And the heat was the kind that made your bones feel hollow. Foba Dustoff was a patch of dust and razor wire in southern Kandahar, surrounded by terrain that looked the same no matter which way you turned. Flat, dry beige. Nothing moved fast in that place, except bullets. Curtis had been in country just under 9 months, sergeant, then. Communications lead for his squad. He wasn't flashy, wasn't the loud one. But when things broke, he fixed them. When things got tense, people looked to him, not because he barked orders, but because he stayed steady when others didn't. That day, they were doing a routine security sweep with a recon team near an abandoned outpost. Curtis wasn't even supposed to be out with them. He'd volunteered to replace a younger soldier who'd been running a fever. Just said, "I've got it," and packed his gear at AT-1447. The first IED went off. It didn't hit anyone. Just shook the ground, tore open the dirt behind their convoy. Then came the gunfire from 3 directions. It was an ambush. Curtis' team scattered behind the wrecked Humvees. .2 were hit early. Specialist Rivera in the leg, Corporal Leland in the shoulder. The team medic, Harper, dragged them behind a broken wall while Curtis radioed for air support. Only the radio wasn't working. The antenna had been cracked during the blast, and the backup system was spotty. It meant no chopper, no overwatch. Just them. Curtis knew the window was closing, ammo was running low. Every few minutes, someone would yell for position. Then came the mortar. They missed by about 50 feet. Close enough to let everyone know the next one might not. That's when Curtis climbed onto the roof of the outpost.no cover. No backup. Just him, a cracked comms unit, and a pair of binoculars. Bramley, get the hell down. Someone had shouted from below. But he stayed. Because he knew the signal was stronger up high, and because someone had to spot the enemy positions, track the coordinates, and send the right message to the right person. Fast. From that rooftop, Curtis watched as smoke filled the air and dust curled through the sun. He counted movement. He called in numbers. At one point, he took a piece of shrapnel through his side. He felt the heat, the rip, but didn't flinch. Just applied pressure with one hand and kept working with the other. At 15:12, the extraction order came through. They were going to be lifted out. North side, half a click away. But they needed someone to keep the shooters busy. Curtis didn't wait for a vote. He stayed. He held that rooftop for 9 more minutes, long enough for everyone to get out. By the time the last boots cleared the zone, Curtis was half conscious. He was pulled from the roof by a squad that came in on the second chopper. He never told anyone what those 9 minutes felt like. He never wanted to. But the people who served with him remembered. They told the story to anyone who would listen, not because Curtis wanted glory, but because what he did saved lives. Back in Brambleton, 20 years later, The name Curtis Bramley didn't appear on plaques. There was no statue, no ceremony, but Therese, Alonzo, Tanner, and Jory. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the reason they made it back, and they hadn't forgotten. Not 1 second of it. But Brambleton had never heard that story, not until now, and that truth was about to shake more than just one person. Reese parked the rented SUV outside Marla's pantry on Sycamore Avenue. It was the kind of place that sold both hot coffee and motor oil. Small-town logic at its finest. The kind of place Curtis used to joke about when they were stationed together. Where else can you get a tire plug and a meatloaf sandwich under one roof? Inside, the air smelled like fried potatoes and bleach. A bell over the door rang as the 4 men stepped in. Marla glanced up from behind the counter, recognizing none of them. At first, "You boys aren't from around here," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tourists don't usually come through Brambleton unless they got lost." "We are here for a few days," Reese replied with a polite nod, looking to talk to folks. "Mind if we ask you a question?" Marla squinted. "Depends who's asking." Reese Godwin, that's Alonzo, Tanner, and Jory. He gestured around him. "We served with a man named Curtis Bramley. Heard he lives nearby." Marla tilted her head, caught off guard. "Curtis. He comes in for apple fritters every Thursday, always leaves $1 in the tip jar, even though we tell him not to. He's a good man," Alonzo added, his voice low. "More than good," Jory said. "The reason 3 of us are still standing." Marla put her hands on the counter and leaned in. "I always knew there was something different about him. You could feel it. Quiet kind of strength. That was all they needed." They left a $20 on the counter and moved on. Next stop was Grace Baptist Church. Not because they were looking for God, but because they knew the community would be there. Even midweek, Pastor Lyle Turner was out front, chatting with an elderly man about cracked concrete. "You Reverend Turner?" Reese asked as they walked up. "Depends who's asking." The pastor replied with a smile. Reese repeated their names, explained their connection to Curtis. Pastor Turner's demeanor shifted, not with fear, but respect. He nodded slowly and said, "Curtis saved my cousin's life, Damon. Served in the same unit. Said he was the calmest voice he ever heard during gunfire." The pastor's voice grew quiet. "But Curtis never talks about it. Just shows up here now and then to fold chairs after Sunday service." They talked for 15 more minutes. About character. About decency. Not a single person they met described Curtis with grand words. Just consistent ones. Steady, loyal, honest. By the time they reached their last stop, the Brambleton Courier's modest little office, word had already gotten around. The receptionist, a young woman with a septum ring and chipped nail polish, peeked over the desk. "You guys the SEALs?" Reese blinked. "Guess that's us? Thought so. My uncle saw you at Marla's. Said you were asking about Mr. Bramley." "Just telling the truth," Tanner said. The editor, Curtis Quinton, no relation, agreed to a short chat. He didn't promise to print anything. Didn't make a show of it, but he listened. Listened as each of the 4 men gave their version of the story. Each from a different memory, a different moment, a different part of the same bond. When they left the newspaper office, none of them said much. Back at Curtis's apartment, the man himself was sitting by the window, a book resting face down on his knee. He didn't know about the conversations. He didn't know about the church, the cafe, or the whispering around town. He only knew one thing. Something had shifted, because when he walked to the corner store that evening, people didn't avoid eye contact. They didn't rush past. Mrs. Ridgway from 2 floors down gave him a smile. A real one. Troy, the gas station kid, gave a quick nod. Even Tressa Nolan, who'd once called him that man from the buses, greeted him by name. He didn't ask why. Didn't want the answer. But he felt it. Something in the town had started to tilt. But the real shift wouldn't come from whispers or nods. It would come from a conversation long overdue. The knock at Curtis's door wasn't loud. Just 3 soft taps, spaced evenly. Like someone trying not to disturb the air too much. Curtis looked up from his chair. He wasn't expecting anyone. The 4 had left town that morning, back to their homes and families. He'd watched them load into the SUV from his kitchen window. No big farewell. No handshakes, just a quiet wave from Reese, one veteran to another. He rose slowly, one hand steadying himself on the table as he walked to the door. When he opened it, he didn't hide his surprise. It was Celeste. Hair pinned up. Simple slacks, low heels. No driver. No assistant, just her. Curtis didn't say anything. He just raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting. I'd like to talk, she said. He studied her for a second, then stepped aside. The apartment was tidy but lived in. A calendar on the wall. Books stacked neatly on the coffee table. 2 mugs in the sink. She followed him into the living room and sat down carefully. Like the furniture might judge her, Curtis lowered himself into the armchair across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. Celeste cleared her throat. I'm not sure where to begin. You can start anywhere, Curtis said evenly. She looked at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I didn't know who you were, I figured. He replied. I wasn't looking, she admitted. That's part of the problem. Curtis let that hang for a beat, then said, not many do. She nodded. The splash. The papers. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. No, he said softly. You didn't. I told myself later that I didn't see you. That it was just bad timing. Maybe, Curtis said, but I wasn't invisible. That sentence knocked something loose in her. Her lips parted like she might argue, but nothing came out. She lowered her eyes instead. I read about you, she said after a long pause. Kandahar, the rooftop. The men you saved. I didn't save anyone, Curtis said. We all had a job. I just did mine. You almost died. I almost did a lot of things, he said with a tired half smile. Celeste leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? I mean, people should know. There should be some sort of recognition. Curtis shook his head. I've had enough uniforms for one life. Don't need parades. Silence settled again. But this one felt different. Less heavy, like something had cleared. Celeste glanced around the room, taking in the small signs of his life. A framed photo on the shelf. Curtis with a fishing rod, standing next to a boy who looked just like him. Maybe a nephew. Maybe more. I came here because I wanted to say something, she said. I figured that too, he replied. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. You could hear it in her voice. Low, almost trembling, not just for splashing you. For not.